Well, a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Jason Liem. I run a company called Mind Talk. I work as a coach, a sparring partner, and a facilitator, teaching people about brain science and teaching them clinical and cognitive skills in order to manage themselves, manage others, and manage situations. Now, in today's lecture, in today's workshop, I'm going to be talking about how we can escape the trap of overthinking. I think a lot of us have been caught in this trap of overthinking, considering the special times, these surreal times we find ourselves in. And if we are able to, escape our ruminations, to escape our over negative thinking, well, that empowers us. Well, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be giving you a model. Now, from this model, as you can see, it's a 4-point star in a sense. What it is, in order to escape overthinking, we need to be in the center, in the self. And in the self, as you can see around it, you have sort of the thinking, you have the emotions, and the body. The body being sort of our physical sensations, our behavior. We want to be present in the here and now to understand what we're thinking, what we're emoting, and how we're acting. Now, the four cardinal points you see their sort of outlook. What is the perspective we take? Narrative. What is the narrative? What is the story we're telling ourselves? We can be looking at sort of the energy. How is our energy? Are we getting enough sleep? Are we eating properly? Are we dealing with things when we are on top of the game? And the last one is our attention. Where are we placing our attention? Now, as we go through this, I'm going to give you all sorts of tools, and I want you to be able to hang the tools on this model. Because the idea here is to have specific tools that you can use 5 minutes outside of this workshop, this lecture. They are simple, but they're field tested, but there's a deep elegance and effectiveness to that simplicity. One. Now, anytime we move into a new situation, our brain is assessing two variables, resources and demands. Now, resources could be external resources such as time, money, and effort that we need to invest in to deal with the situation. But it can also be internal resources. Now, this may be a level of self-confidence, a level of self-doubt. It's our mind talk. It's the narrative that we're telling ourselves. Now, it may be a very positive, constructive narrative that pushes us through the current dilemma or conundrum. But it might also be a negative narrative we're telling us, overthinking, rumination. Now, where the brain ideally likes to be is in a place of certainty. Here our resources far outstrip the demands of the situation. Now, this may be your current position, your current job. You know the roles and responsibilities. You've been there for a while, so you have deep knowledge, deep experience in which to draw from. Well, this is not where overthinking pops up. Overthinking and rumination tends to pop up when there is uncertainty. And this is when the demands of the situation increase to tax our resources, and our resources, we feel, drop. Now, to illustrate this as an example, I'm going to talk about two people, Jane and Jason. Both of them are facing a change that showed up on their doorstep uninvited. They don't like it, they could wish it away, but they know they have to deal with it. What does Jane do? Well, Jane decides to, the cowboy up. She wants to deal with the situation. She doesn't like it, but she's motivated to deal with it, to get it behind her. So her thinking is about what she can control, what she can influence. Maybe she does not know what the final outcome is, but she's focused on step 1 and step 2. She's thinking to her past. She may be thinking, okay, what have I dealt with before that's familiar to me? What aspects can I confidently move through? Who can I speak to? Where can I find resources and sources? So we can see that Jane's narrative tends to be constructive. So her brain interprets that as a challenge. This new change is a challenge. And what does that mean? Her resources are just slightly above the demands of the situation. So her brain interprets it as something that she can deal with. Even though she doesn't like it, she's dealing with it. And this has an immediate impact on her physiology. What happens? Well, her veins, her blood vessels, they open up. And there's more blood coursing through it. So she's more mentally incapable of dealing with the situation. Now, Jason, on the other hand, remember, identical situation. But what he tends to do, what he chooses to do, is to focus on the things he can't control, what he can't influence. Instead of focusing on the facts, He's focusing on his opinions, his beliefs of how things are going to go sideways, how things are going to go south on him. He's worried about the consequences of crossing a bridge, but Jason doesn't even know if those bridges actually exist. And so his brain says, okay, Jason, and interprets it this way, that, all right, demands of the situation far outstrip your resources, both external and internal. And thus it sees it not as a challenge, but sees the current change as a threat. And this creates a different physiological as well as psychological response. But physiologically, it's the opposite of Jason. His blood vessels constrict, there's blood flow, and thus he feels mentally and physically less capable of dealing with the situation.
Now, as we just explored, we talked about Jane and Jason. Jane, she interpreted a situation she did not like in a constructive way. She looked at what she could handle, what she could do, and thus, between resources and demands, her brain saw the situation as a challenge. She was motivated to get through it. Jason, on the other hand, identical situation, but he talked himself down. His mind talk was more pessimistic, more negative. You know, he put the power outside of him, where Jane, she took the power. And what has happened? Well, as we've already explored, we've already talked about certainty. And I always talk about there's that each of us as human beings, we need two psychological pillars. One is certainty, which we've explored, and the other one is the sense of autonomy. Now, autonomy is just that, it's a sense of control, it's having oversight. We tend to overthink when certainty moves into uncertainty and autonomy moves into a lack of control. And this is where I want to talk about how we interpret the situations between resource and demands can affect our mindset. Now, there's a book that I'd highly recommend all of you to read if you haven't already read it. It's by Daniel Kahneman. Now, Daniel Kahneman is the godfather of a discipline that started roughly in the early 70s to mid 70s called behavioral economics. It's the study of how humans tend to make choices. And that's saying that we're not always rational. Now, he talks about two systems, system one and system two. What we're going to refer to them as the autopilot, and the other one, which is the pilot seat, which I'll get to in a moment. But the autopilot is that part of our brain that is based on habits, that's based on patterns. It's about reactive or fast thinking. It's about unconscious attention, meaning that the brain is constantly monitoring things around us. And it's about automatic processing. Now, the other mindset is what we call the pilot seat. Now, the pilot seat is what Kahneman refers to as system two. But the pilot seat, if we remember back to the mind talk model, it's when we are present, when we are centered, and we're aware of the triad of things, of our thinking, our emotions, and our body. And remember, the body is sort of our physical sensations and how we behave. Now, the pilot seat, it's about slow thinking. It's about being reflective. It's about being objective. It's about placing our conscious attention where we want it. And that's exactly where we want to be when we're in the pilot seat. We turn off the autopilot and we're flying the plane ourselves. And we guide it to where we want to go. But it's also about deliberate reasoning, meaning I can take apart a problem, I can look at my emotions, I can look at my thoughts and examine them and ask myself, what do I want to do with it? Well, the autopilot mindset, now, either of these mindsets are neither good nor bad, but they have their place. But if we're talking about in a stressful, demanding, overwhelming situation where we are filled with worry and concern and anxiety, well, the autopilot is definitely where we don't want, because then we're going to go on our sort of our automatic responses, our habitual survival responses. And that's where Jason was when it was resources and demands, because his brain interpreted as a threat. Where Jane, on the other hand, she sat in the pilot seat. She didn't like the situation, but she was motivated to deal with it. She slowed it down and became reflective and objective. Now, why is this important? Well, beyond what's obvious, what's also important is how we think. Now, think about it. Jason was in an autopilot mode. Jane was in a pilot seat mode. Now, both of them are looking to the future. Let's go to Jane for a second, the pilot seat mindset. She saw the future, but she was being, keyword here, strategic. She was planning her steps. She didn't know maybe what the outcome was, but she was thinking about steps 1 and 2. Jason, on the other hand, was in a autopilot mindset, was just reacting. He was lost in his subjective world. And so he saw the future as the final outcome. He didn't know what the outcome was. He wasn't even thinking about the sort of the short-term game about steps 1 or 2. He was just thinking all the things that could go wrong, that could go sideways on him. Now, as I said, 50% of our thoughts tend to be in the future, but 40% of our thoughts day to day also tend to be in the past. Now, Jane and Jason, again, in a demanding situation, Jane was looking to her past, but she was looking at her archive of knowledge and experience and see what she could draw from her past to help her with the present to move towards through the future to deal with the situation. So she was what? She was in the pilot seat. She was being constructive about her thinking. Jason, on the other hand, he was thinking about all the past things that have failed, all the things that have gone wrong, and how the past was probably going to be a predictive of the future, and how things are going to go awful in the future because it went awful in the past. Now, 10% of our thoughts are generally focused in the here and now. Jane, she was focused on the here and now, but she was drawing from her past and thinking about how to strategize about the future. Jason wasn't even present, hardly very present now. His mind was racing from the past about past failures and was racing to the future. He wasn't strategizing, but the key word here, he was speculating. And there's a huge difference about how we interpret a situation. Now, Jane and Jason interpreted it differently, even though it was an identical situation. One will move constructively into the situation, but Jason, he won't. His brain is interpreted as a threat, and that actually closes him down, and overthinking flourishes in his brain.
So, what exactly is overthinking? Well, let's take a look at thinking itself. Let's look at an individual thought. Now, each individual thought itself is a building block that leads to thinking. Now, but an individual thought is very important. It's very powerful. An individual thought can trigger an emotion. It can trigger behavior. It can trigger us to engage with the world or disengage with the world. A single thought influences our opinions, our attitudes, and how we approach, how we communicate to ourselves, how we collaborate, how we cooperate, how we make decisions. But when you have the one thought, but then you have the drip, drip, drip thoughts, you have a stream of thoughts, well, this becomes the narrative that runs through our head. Now, a narrative is something that we tell ourselves may only be 3 or 4 sentences. It may be in the form of a statement, a sentence, or a negative question, maybe a constructive question. But when it comes to overthinking, it's going to be of a negative nature, something that is unhelpful to us. Now, when we talk about a narrative, there's actually something called the default mode network in our heads, or something we can call the narrative network. Now, as you can see the image here, this is the part of the brain that kind of glows when the narrative network is running. What does that mean? Well, the narrative network it runs anytime we think about ourselves. Our attention, instead of focusing out towards the world, it becomes internal, where we take center stage on our mind's stage. We become the center of things. The world revolves around us. Everyone, the situation is about us. It's self-focused. Now, the narrative network is okay. We use it when we need to strategize about how we are going to move forward into the future. It also is triggered when we're daydreaming about a vacation coming up, about a party, about something, some event. But it's also triggered when we're overthinking. Instead of us being attentive to possible opportunities and ways of dealing with the situations, to be solution-oriented, our attention becomes fixated internally. We get stuck in a revolving cycle of negative thoughts that spirals down. A thought triggers an emotion, that emotion triggers negative behavior or not very helpful behavior, which triggers more negative thoughts. And so this narrative is something that we want to get hold of. Overthinking is about changing the narrative in our head. If we change the narrative, we change our emotional responses. If we change the narrative, we change our behavior and our actions, where we become more reflective instead of reactive.
Now here I want to pull together all of the three networks we've covered so far. So on this graph, going up the vertical line there, we've labeled emotional stability. Along the bottom axis, you see the further we go to the right, the better we are at planning. Now, we've just talked about the narrative network, how that is the network where we can either strategize, where we are daydreaming, or we're overthinking. And when we're overthinking is when that's working in conjunction with the autopilot mindset or network. This is where Jason was. And when the two of these are going, well, what happens? He's speculating. He's guessing about the future. You know, his emotional stability is very low, and his ability to plan is also very low. But where we want to shift is where Jane was. Like in the Mind Talk model, we want to be in the center and the self, looking out to the triad of thinking, emotions, and body. And when these are networking together, like Jane, then we're strategizing. We may not know what the final outcome is, but we're thinking about facts, about what we control, and what we can have certainty about. Now, a book that I highly recommend to people is Viktor E. Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning. Now, Mr. Frankel, he was an Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist. He is also a Holocaust survivor. You know, his whole line of therapy that he called logotherapy basically means it's the meaning we give to a situation. And what he witnessed, what he experienced firsthand, was how the Nazis could strip everything away from you. But what they couldn't strip away from you, if you didn't allow it, was the meaning we give to a situation. Now, a very famous quote that I use all the time, he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. You know, in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. Now, the key here is what Viktor Frankl said. It's about creating a space in which we have a chance to respond. You know, for every trigger, there's going to be a corresponding response. But as human beings, we have the chance to stop things. We have a chance to open up a space. Jason, in our example from earlier, didn't do this. There was a stimulus and responded. And what happened? Well, his brain interpreted what? As a threat. What did Jane do? Well, she was in this identical situation and she had the negative emotions, maybe negative thoughts, but she stopped up and observed and reflected. She moved from the autopilot mindset, which is an actual neural circuit, to the pilot seat, where she added observation and reflection, and then she chose her response. One of the most powerful tools, and it's right here, guys, is to ask yourself, how do I choose to respond? You will have the initial thoughts and emotions. You can't do anything about them. But the question is, do you follow into the autopilot and go into a survival panic mode of thinking like Jason? No. If we stop and observe whether they are negative thoughts or negative or positive emotions, we can examine them and then choose our response. Thoughts and emotions are not instructions. You know, they're not directives of what you have to do. But Jason, or you or myself, whenever we're in autopilot mode, in that survival primal lockdown, we're going to think, okay, I'm thinking this has got to be truth. I'm emoting this, so it's got to be true. I got to follow it. No. Be like Jane. Stop up, create that space, and realize that thoughts and emotions are just information. And it's this information that we can choose what to do. Now, think about it like if you drive a car, whether it's an electric car or a gasoline-driven car, right? On your dashboard, you have different things that come up, signals that come up. It might say, oh, you're running low on fuel or you're running low on battery energy. It's not an instruction that you must stop now and fill up. No, it's just information. You look at it and you decide, Okay, I can make it to my destination, or no, I need to stop at the next station or charging station. You can make the choice. So, thoughts and emotions are show up on your mental dashboard. They're not instructives and directives. And they can feel like that when we're in a reactive, anxious state of mind. But be like Jane. Stop up, create the pause, add observation and reflection. It's information, and ask yourself, what do I choose to do with this information? Now, and another important point is that when we are in a reactive or autopilot state of mind, we will identify with the emotions. What do I mean? Well, we'll say, I am angry, I am frustrated, I am overwhelmed. Once we identify with an emotion, what happens is we get subjectively lost in that emotion. The ability to move from the autopilot to the pilot seat also means we have to be wary or conscious of the language we choose. What I do when I'm working with my clients is to move them from a reactive state of mind to a reflective state of mind, from the autopilot to the pilot seat. And what do? Well, we just add a couple of verbs. Instead of saying, I am angry, we say, I notice I'm feeling angry, or I observe I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I perceive that I'm feeling a little frustrated. Now, what's the difference? It seems like semantics, but there's a huge difference. I am angry is a subjective feeling, meaning you get lost in the emotion. I notice, I observe, or I perceive, well, that means you shift to an objective pilot seat. You're in the self and you're actually perceiving your thoughts and emotions, and then you can decide. So, by actually just shifting the verbs or how we construct our sentences, what that means is that we become the observer. We become reflective. We open the space, we observe and reflect, and then we can choose our response. So choose language carefully. So another tool. Now you can draw two circles on a post-it note or on a piece of paper, what have you. But this, again, this is back to Jane and Jason about stopping overthinking. Now Jason and Jane, they were in an identical situation if we recall. What did Jane decided to do? She probably felt negative emotions and negative thoughts. She wished it wasn't there, but she decided to deal with it. What did she do? She focused on what she could control. She moved to the pilot seat. So what I suggest is draw two circles and ask yourself, what do I control? What do I influence? What are the facts? What experience or knowledge can I draw from my past to help me? What Jason did, what a lot of us do naturally, is to start off in the outer circle. Jane started off in the outer circle, right, in the autopilot, and she was focused on what she maybe not control or how bad things might play out. But she created a space, she noticed her feelings, she observed her thoughts, and decided, how do I choose my response? And so she shifted from the outer circle to the inner circle. Jason didn't. He was in the autopilot. He was just reacting. He was just lost in the subjective narrative and never made that shift. What I suggest to you, create that space, guys, and make that shift. Once you make that shift, you literally change the mindset, which means you literally shift the circuits or the network in your head, and you stop overthinking. Emotions are like an internal weather system. Our attention is the force that can shift the weather. Instead of looking towards all the things that can go wrong, what we want to do is take that narrative network and shift it outwards towards routine, towards things that we can do, that we can take action, where we can move forward. By focusing on things such as our hobbies and our passions and things we like to do, we can immediately shift the emotions, and overthinking just turns right off.
Well, here we are at the end of this talk, escaping the trap of overthinking. I hope you found the science stimulating. I hope you found the skills of something practical that you can use. And, overthinking is something that affects us all. I mean, no one can escape it. But what we can do is that we can choose to stop up. As we talked about, you can observe and reflect, and you can choose how you want to respond. Because any thoughts or negative emotions that we feel, they're legitimate. I mean, they will spring up, and we can't help it. But the question is, how can we remember to see it as information and not to take them as simply as instructions? Learn each situation. You will fall victim to overthinking. It is inevitable. I do it, and I talk about it all the time, and I help people all the time, and I still fall into that trap. But over time, you will learn. I have learned to get better at escaping the trap of overthinking. I wish you well. I wish you all the best. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk soon. Bye for now.